Hi, thanks for listening to At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. On today's installment of the podcast, we're going to shift gears quite a bit. If you've been listening to the podcast for really any length of time, you know that we normally concentrate on education, training, career opportunities for the military community, and that's always going to be our primary focus. But in this edition of the podcast, the topic is coming straight from the headlines we've all been following for the past week. In fact, just over 7 days ago, Russian forces under Vladimir Putin invaded the neighboring country of Ukraine, triggering Europe's worst conflict since World War II. Over the past 7 days, Russian forces have entered Ukrainian territory and tried to capture some of that country's largest population centers, including Mariupol on the Black Sea coast, Kharkiv, and the capital of Kyiv. Now, as of this taping, which is on Friday, the 4th of March, at least one major city, Kherson, in the south along the Black Sea coast, has been captured. Resistance, as you know, from Ukrainian military forces and even ordinary Ukrainian citizens has been both fierce, heroic, and inspiring. But they're battling against very long odds. Despite problems so far with logistics, morale, planning, and coordination, the Russians appear to have enough combat power to slowly gain their objectives, but at a very huge cost in lives. By some estimates, as many as 5,000 Russian troops may have been killed so far, along with a large number of Ukrainian military personnel. We also have had reports that several hundred Ukrainian civilians have been killed, and of course that total, unfortunately, is going to certainly rise as Russian forces close on Ukraine cities and they attempt to level them. For an assessment of the ongoing war in Ukraine and what comes next, we'll speak with a couple of experts on Eastern European politics and security policy from Christopher Newport University here in Newport News. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this episode of At Ease. But first, a message for military spouses in our audience. Now, this may not be news to you, but by some estimates, as many as 1/3 of all military spouses are unemployed or underemployed. One reason? When you're moving to a new location every 3 or 4 years, it's difficult to develop career skills, especially those that are portable. They can help you land a new job when your family makes that next PCS move. That's why DoD created the MyCAA, or My Career Advancement account. It provides up to $4,000 for military spouses who want to master new skills, maybe earn a credential that improves their employment prospects, or take classes that will eventually lead to a degree-based certification like teaching or perhaps a nursing degree. An important caveat, this program is only open to spouses of military members in pay grades E1 through E5, W1 and W2, and O1 and O2. So if your spouse is in one of those pay grades, you probably qualify. So what are you waiting for? Take your skills and careers to the next level with MyCAA at Thomas Nelson. Learn more by calling us at 757-825-2938, or you can email me, PounderG, that's POUNDERG, at tncc.edu. A new career that can travel with you during your military moves? Well, it's closer than you think at Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. For this special edition on the crisis in Ukraine, we're joined by two noted experts, both of whom are on the faculty at Christopher Newport University here in Newport News. First of all, we're joined by Dr. Tatiana Rizova. She's an associate professor of political science at CNU. Among her academic credentials, she holds a master's in political science from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and a PhD in political science from UCLA. Her areas of expertise include post-communist politics, political parties in transitional societies, right-wing radical political groups in Eastern Europe, ethnic conflict, migrant crisis, among others. And you can see again that her areas of expertise are very much related to what we see going on in Eastern Europe right now. And we certainly look forward to her thoughts and insights on what we see going on in Ukraine right now. We're also very pleased to be joined today by one of CNU's living legends, Dr. Mario Mazzarella. Spent 44 years on the faculty at CNU in the history department. He's now emeritus professor of history. He holds a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island and a PhD from American University. He is a noted scholar on European history, and he's been following the current crisis very closely. Dr. Rizova, Dr. Mazzarella, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let's get right into where we stand right now. We're taping this again on the 4th of March. If both of you could, give me, what is your current assessment of the situation both on the ground in Ukraine and the political environment?
I think the situation is certainly escalating, and there are some very concerning developments as the Russian convoy is getting closer and closer to Kiev and getting ready to seize the city. The most recent concern, of course, is the seizure of the nuclear power plant. Now, I want to mention that when I was growing up in Eastern Europe as a young teenager during the Cold War, I did live through the Chernobyl catastrophe. And it will be really serious and, of course, devastating if anything similar to that happens. So I think one of the big concerns for me definitely remains the threat of a nuclear meltdown if those facilities are compromised, and certainly the increasing potential for use of more lethal weapons on the ground and more civilian and military casualties. I think we are approaching that moment when the Ukrainian people and military will be involved in battle in more of a urban style warfare than military to military.
And that leads to a question I would like to pose to both of you. Are we seeing, first of all, a momentum shift toward the Russians right now? It seemed that very early in the conflict, the Ukrainians fighting bravely and heroically were literally fighting the Russians to a standstill. But as someone once observed, that quantity has a quality all its own. The Russians clearly outnumber. They outgun the Ukrainians across the board. Are we seeing kind of a shift in momentum to the Russian side right now? And additionally, are we seeing a change in Russian tactics and strategy? Initially, it seemed to be that they were going to try to overrun the country very quickly, seize Kyiv, inflict minimal casualties, install a puppet regime, and probably declare victory and go home. And when that didn't happen, now we see the Russians going back to a more traditional Russian way of war based on enormous firepower, surrounding cities, targeting civilian population centers, and a complete disregard for collateral damage and civilian casualties.
Well, you're certainly correct about weight having its own quality. I was reminded this past week of the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-1940, where the Russians attacked the Finns and expected this to be a walkover. And they were very badly surprised when the Finns, using advantages of their knowledge of the terrain and innovative tactics, although badly outgunned and badly outnumbered, fought them almost to a standstill. Eventually, the Finns did lose, but only after the Russians suffered tremendous casualties. There was kind of a backhanded benefit to this. The Germans observing this, Hitler thought, good grief, the Russians can't even lick the lousy Finns. We'll walk all over them. That didn't happen either. But the example here was the Finnish example. I'm afraid that the Ukrainians, no matter how much damage they do to the Russians in the long run, the Russians, if they continue their offensive and are sufficiently ruthless, you commented about a change of tactics here. I think many people expected, in the West especially, this would be a quick coup de main. The Russians would come in, they would whack the Ukrainians hard, but they would take over fairly quickly with minimal damage. This does not seem to be going according to plan, in spite of what Putin said the other night. On the contrary, all sorts of problems are showing up here, which are dragging this thing out. And this is not making Putin happy. I think that, indeed, if he cannot bring this to a quick close with the lighter hand, I think his inclination will be to become absolutely ruthless in this And we will see battles such as we have not seen since World War II. The Ukrainians, their ability to resist has not been fully tested yet. Their conventional forces are apparently doing a superb job, but this arming of civilians and so forth, to create a real obstacle to them militarily, that has not been tested. If they do try to enter a city like Kyiv, then we will see if all these civilian defense measures will have any weight and any real effect, or if the Russians simply blow everything to hell in front of them and then move forward. They did this in 1956 in Budapest, but they simply rolled tanks down the street, and if they saw anything moving at a window anywhere, they just fired on it. And they crushed the Hungarian Revolution. But of course, that has all sorts of long-range consequences. It will completely embitter the Ukrainian population, and Putin will have on his hands an extremely unfriendly group of people who hate him with an absolute passion and may resort to guerrilla warfare against him. If only the Ukrainians had some mountains they could hide in, they could drag this out like the Afghans. But they may be able to do this anyway. Dr. Rizova mentioned urban warfare. That is a particularly nasty kind of warfare, and it's extremely expensive on everybody. We'll see how much blood will be shed before there may be a rethinking in Moscow, not only on Putin's part, but other people's part, as to whether this game is worth the candle. Right now, we are in such an indeterminate stage. It's hard. So many possibilities are out there. It could go in so many different directions. It's hard to tell. But to answer your initial question, it does look like now that things are moving in a Russian, to favor the Russian moves. We will see how that continues to go. We have to simply watch to see how this unfolds.
Looking at the problems the Russians have encountered so far in their operation, and very clearly they're off their initial timetable, Dr. Rizova, I was wondering, was this a case of where the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians' ability to resist? Is this an example of them overestimating their own military capabilities? Was there a breakdown between Putin and his military leadership, a breakdown between the commanders of the Russian forces and the ordinary soldiers and lower-level commanders who actually have to carry the operation? What do you see as being the problems and the causes of the problems that the Russians are experiencing so far?
I definitely see evidence of several miscalculations on behalf of Putin and the Russian military high command. One of the miscalculations is underestimating the ability of the Ukrainian people to resist, which they have manifested in so many different ways. Of course, they are outnumbered. They are overpowered in terms of weapons. But one thing that we should never estimate is the spirit of the people and their willingness to die for their motherland. And the Ukrainian people have demonstrated that very clearly. Another miscalculation, in my opinion, is the morale of the Russian military itself. Think about who these people are. Many of them are probably fairly young Russian natives who probably don't really think of Ukrainians as their natural enemy. For me, any fellow Slav is a brother or a sister. And I can only imagine that your 19, 20-year-old Russian soldier does not really feel or think of Ukrainians as their enemies. So it's a very difficult kind of, regardless of all the propaganda that the Russian propaganda machine has generated over the past decade or so, I think it's really difficult to make a compelling argument that Ukraine should be dismembered or it should be annexed in some form or attacked by Russia. So I think one of the miscalculations is certainly the morale of the Russian soldiers themselves. One thing that I thought was really interesting and gave me some pause was the fact that the convoy moving toward Kiev took such a long time to approach the city. And I know that based on intelligence reports, based on what I've read, the thinking was that perhaps they ran out of supplies, there was some logistical problems, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I wonder whether that convoy was simply not in a terrible rush to get to Kiev. And there was a little bit of strategic waiting out of let's see how much pressure we can apply, whether they will surrender. So I see it on the one hand, there could have been a logistical issue. I don't have access to that information, of course. I'm not an intelligence officer, but I think there was perhaps a little bit of a tactical waiting out as well. So there have been several miscalculations, but also several shifts in tactics as well.
I think those are very good points, and I also believe that your note about this perhaps being an operational pause for the Russians is probably a factor in the overall calculus. From the Russian point of view, they see time as being on their side. They would like to end this as quickly as possible. They will drag it out if they have to. And so they're waiting for other things to fall into place before they fully commit those forces north of Kyiv to completely envelop the city and then be able to fire on the city from all sides and conduct the kind of urban battles we saw in Grozny back in the 1990s, and of course when they took Berlin at the end of World War II. And that kind of leads me to my next question. First of all, from what you've seen, how long do you think the Ukrainians can sustain their current level of resistance?
That is such a difficult prediction to make. We do know at the moment that Ukrainians have not deployed the full military capacity. I was reading a really interesting article yesterday about the drone squadron. They do have access to more advanced military technology that we're not fully aware of or have read bits and pieces about. So I am aware that they have yet to deploy their full military capacity to fight against Russia. So I'm definitely thinking that the two factors we're looking at right now is the ability of Ukraine to quickly mobilize people who can fight against the invaders, and on the other hand, the ability and willingness of foreign powers to provide all the ammunition and the military assistance that the Ukrainians will definitely need. The statement that President Zelensky made a few days ago, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, I think definitely struck a chord with Western powers. And I think we're probably looking at a drawn out style warfare unless something changes and something is brokered in the course of negotiations. But right now, I'm not very optimistic because it seems like Putin is definitely digging in his heels.
On that note, Dr. Mazzarella, you were talking about perhaps the shift to insurgency warfare. Do you see that, given the quantitative advantage the Russians have, do you see that as becoming inevitable? There's going to be a rise of a significant Ukrainian insurgency, and we'll see those kinds of battles between Russian conventional and special forces, Ukrainian insurgents in the cities and the countryside, and a guerrilla war that could perhaps drag on for many, many years? And how quickly do you think we will see this insurgency begin to emerge?
Well, I think we will learn, if Putin unleashes his full forces, just how effective or ineffective this will be. It has yet to be tested. The conventional forces are doing astonishingly well. The airfield to the west of Kyiv has been recaptured several times, I heard on the news this morning. So they are not simply lying down and letting this happen. But you asked about the unconventional warfare. And all I can say is that we have to see whether it will develop. One would hope it would. But it's going to be very expensive on both sides. It's going to be a lot of civilian casualties if this happens, or if you will, the territorial force casualties and whatnot. You mentioned the column. Dr. Rizova mentioned the column north of Kyiv. This is extremely interesting. There is a bottleneck here. The weather has not treated the Russians well. The ground is softer than they would like. Tanks do not do well in soft ground. People think, they can go anywhere. No, they can't. They will actually get bogged down and have to be rescued. So right now there is this tremendous bottleneck along this road. For some way to blow the devil out of the head of that column and create a major roadblock for any further progress. So far, the Ukrainians have not done this. I don't know whether they have the capacity to. How could it be accomplished? If they could get on the flanks of the column and fire handheld missiles at it, That would be one way, but I suppose the Russians, if they're smart at all, have the flanks protected by infantry. If they had aircraft, of course, they could directly launch attacks on it. Perhaps drones might give them a way to do this. Now, I'm switching from back to conventional warfare for just a moment. But you asked about the unconventional warfare. We have yet to see if the determination of the forces we've seen so far is any indication. I suspect we will see an insurgency, and it will be effective. But we have to see by actions just what occurs.
And looking back at our own experience in Iraq, we went into the country in 2003, but the insurgency there really didn't reach full flower until about 2005, 2006, prompting the surge. So it does take a while for guerrillas to organize their operational cells, to acquire the weaponry they need, to develop intelligence, to be able to have networks to funnel supplies, money, and all the other things they need to run that kind of an operation. So I think you're exactly right. It may not emerge immediately, but it would certainly develop, and I think develop, over a period of time, and perhaps more quickly than what we saw in Iraq. And I want to kind of shift gears right now and get into my next area I'd like to cover with both of you. And obviously, it's the man in the middle of all of this, Vladimir Putin. There's been much discussion, debate, analysis over why is Putin doing this now? Is he attempting to resurrect the old Soviet Union, create those long-desired buffer zones between Russia and the West? Is he trying to fracture NATO? Is he trying to establish himself as being the dominant player in European security matters, weaken U.S. influence in the region? What do you see as Vladimir Putin's rationale, his motivation for conducting this operation at this time?
Well, if I might intervene here as an historian, there's a deep and there's an immediate causations. Go to the deep first. In 1453, yes, you heard that date right, Constantinople fell to the Turks. This was the end of all Roman authority going back for 500 BC. The ruler of Moscow at the time, the Grand Duke, was a man named Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, which means the awe-inspiring. He had married the niece of the last Byzantine or Eastern Roman emperor. When the city fell, the second great Roman capital fell. Ivan adopted the title of Tsar, which is the Russian form of Caesar. He adopted the double-headed eagle as the symbol of the state. That's a Roman symbol. The eagle looks east and west, indicating its right to have dominion over the entire earth. Also, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church moved to Moscow. So Russia was picked up both the political and the religious tradition of the Roman Empire, and Moscow was known as Third Rome. Based on that, Russia then has a world historical mission to protect the true faith, as opposed to Western Christianity, by the way, head by the Pope, of whom nothing good can be said. For a long time. You can see that hostility in Dostoevsky. But the political and the religious elements of the Roman domination. And that has continued on in Russian history right to the present day. Now, there is a counter tradition established by Peter the Great, which was westward looking and progressive and not really in favor of such a strong role for religion. Peter left a very important impression on Russia, and Russia has been constantly torn back and forth between the two throughout its history. But for the most part, it has been with the older tradition, which is known as Slavophilism. Now we come to the communist revolution, and the Russian state is overthrown, and the Russian church is subjected to persecution. And you would think, well, things have all changed. Not as much as they may look, because we go from one infallible faith, Christianity, to another infallible faith, Marxism, with its inevitable victory of the proletariat. So we have substituted, and also Russia, of course, then becomes the champion once again of this new faith. So we have the same thing as before under different forms. To quote the old phrase, the more things change, the more they remain the same. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian state readopted the double-headed eagle as its symbol. picking up the tradition, once again, if you will, of the Third Rome. And Putin's conversion to Christianity, we would not go into how sincere that may be, has made him friends with the Orthodox Church. Right now, there is very little criticism from Orthodox bishops anywhere in the world of Putin. They seem afraid to do so because he has made them his ally against the evil West. And there were all sorts of social elements connected with that. For instance, anti-gay prejudice, defense of traditional values, supposedly. So we have here Putin picking up on a very old Russian tradition of Russia as a defender of the true faith and true civilization, as opposed to the evil West. By the way, in its attack on secular values and its attack and its homophobia and whatnot, and its defense of rather narrow nationalism, this explains, I think, a lot the attraction that Putin has for so many really right-wingers in the United States, for instance, because they share those values, those very values. They're anti-gay, they're super nationalistic. Only in the United States it expresses itself as isolationism rather than a world mission to convert the world, but hostility against the Western secular values as well. So there's a lot in that. So he's not trying to resurrect the old Soviet Union. He's trying to resurrect the old Russian Empire without using that name.
And I think that's a very important point. And I think there's another element, and again, I salute you for highlighting this, because if you look at a lot of the discussions on the talking head shows on cable TV, the religious aspect is largely ignored. And there's another element in this religious controversy, for lack of a better term, that is that there has been an embrace by the West of the new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, separate from the Russian Orthodox Church. And that embrace, I think we even had our former Secretary of State, Pompeo, saluting and commending the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that move obviously enraged Moscow. So does the fact that the West seems to be embracing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church versus the true Russian Orthodox Church, is that one more factor in this entire calculus?
Yes, it does. And by the way, part of the idea of Russia being, a sacred state as a defender of the true faith means that all its old traditional territories, including Ukraine, should be part of it as a matter of moral right. And that it was broken away is seen as an aberration and something which is simply unsupportable.
Moving back to the more political aspects of this, Dr. Rizova, did perceptions of Western weakness by Putin and his advisors, did that influence his decision-making, in your opinion, and prompt him to launch this operation at this time?
Absolutely. And as we very well know, not only perceptions of Western weakness have been at play here, but also Putin's active contribution toward Western weakness. Interfering with elections all over the world, trying to weaken democracies all over the world. The bottom line, in my opinion, as somebody who studies systems around the world comparatively, is that we not only see this juxtaposition of East versus West, we also see the juxtaposition of democracy versus non-democracy. Now, if you were to ask Putin whether he considers Russia a democracy or not, he would by all means state that Russia is a democracy, that he is a democratically elected leader. But as we all know, he is nothing but a tyrant. He's proven that on so many different levels, and tyrants fear freedom, whether it's at home or abroad. And he definitely does not want to have democracy surround the Russian Federation. Back to your question about what are some of the other objectives of the current offensive invasion, definitely continue to weaken the West, including by relying on cyber attacks, cyber warfare, continuing to undermine NATO. He does not want to see a Ukraine that becomes part of Euro-Atlantic structures. He's demonstrated that and been very vocal about that in so many ways. So fracturing NATO, or at least gradually eroding it, undermining it, is definitely one of the items on his agenda. And keeping democratic leaders at bay. He is good friends with Lukashenko of Belarus. He does not want to see a democratic Belarus. He does not want to see a democratic Ukraine. And we know that even democracy in Ukraine is highly problematic. The corruption perceptions index of Ukraine and Russia, in fact, are not that different. Based on the latest numbers, for instance, we have Ukraine ranking 122nd out of 180 countries on the corruption perceptions index, and Russia is 136th. This means that they're definitely toward the latter part on the corruption perceptions index. Based on Freedom House ratings, Ukraine is considered partly free, whereas Russia is considered not free. So regardless of the fact that, or perhaps because democracy in Ukraine is fragile and not stable, this is an opportune moment for Russia to intervene and prevent it from becoming a fully democratic nation, because non-democrats do not surround themselves with Democrats. They surround like attracts like.
Sure.
In this particular respect.
And it's very obvious Putin would prefer to have a puppet regime in Ukraine, much as he has in Belarus right now. Another point that's been bandied about since this crisis began is the failures, supposedly, of U.S. energy and export policies. The thought that if the U.S. had maintained its position as a net energy exporter, that somehow this would have deterred Putin because oil prices would have remained low. Now, with some of the policy decisions made over the past couple of years, the amount that we're producing has dropped. Demand is picking back up with the end of COVID. The crisis obviously factors in too. Oil prices are skyrocketing, oil trading at $115 a barrel or thereabouts, which obviously gives Putin more resources because about half of his economy is rooted in the energy sector. So again, to kind of loop back to my first point, did decisions made in the U.S. regarding energy policy and production, did they help feed into this current crisis?
I definitely think that is one of the elements that has contributed to embolden Putin in the current invasion. Russia has a lot of natural resources, and it is certainly true proof and evidence that the resource curse exists. Countries that are wealthy in natural resources tend to be highly corrupt, and they tend to sustain non-democratic leaders. So, the affinity of the natural resource sector and dictatorship is certainly there. The fact that we are so glacially moving toward improving our energy sector and our energy infrastructure and becoming less dependent on oil and natural gas, I think is definitely a contribution. I don't want to put the entire blame on the U.S. government, because the types of changes we need to reduce dependency on oil are monumental. The United States is a huge economy, and moving toward electric and hybrid is going to take time. I do want to commend the governments of the Nordic countries that are very quickly moving toward, fully electric vehicles. But we do have to keep in mind that the scale there is so much smaller than that in the United States. So perhaps we could pick up the pace of improving infrastructure in the United States and reducing dependency on oil, but Europe will have to do the same. I think we definitely share equal blame in that dependency on oil.
One more question on Putin before we start talking about how the war is playing domestically in Russia. There's been a lot of speculation, some of it based on leaked intelligence information, that Putin is somehow in physical and or mental decline right now, and that these medical issues, if they exist, may be influencing his behavior and his decision-making. Your perspective on that?
My inclination is to distrust such reports. I think what he has done, and this is the failing of autocracy, is eliminated anybody who would talk back to him. Saddam Hussein did this. There was an incident where Saddam Hussein was having a discussion. It was then a discussion with some of his generals. Apparently one of them rather vociferously disagreed with them. He said, well, let's you and I talk about this in the next room. So they left the others at the table. They went into the next room. And then they heard bang! He came out. The other general didn't. This is a good way of stifling any dissent. When you have no one who will tell you that you're wrong, then you have put yourself in a very bad spot. And I think that Putin has put himself in this spot. I don't think there's anybody in his government really who could tell him, this idea stinks, you shouldn't do it. And the danger of that is you will start making bad decisions. And I think that's really what is, whatever other factors are involved. I think that's part of what's going on here. Somebody should have said to him, I think this is maybe a bridge too far. This is going a bit too much. Why don't you just chop off like the eastern part of the country? You can probably get away with that. You know, it'll be a kind of a Crimea writ large. And you can, pat yourself on the back and call yourself a victor and go home. But to try to conquer the entire country is an astonishing thing to do. And I think he has overreached here. You asked about long range prospects before. I think in the long run, this is not going to serve him well. No matter how it turns out, even a so-called victory will be expensive. He may end up with, as we will see, years of an insurgency that will constantly bleed him. Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, once said to his master when he saw that he was relying too much on force, you can do anything with bayonets, except sit on them. Well, you can sit on machine guns a lot longer. You can't sit on them indefinitely. And I think this is, crazy. I don't think he is. Mental decline. I don't see that. But unrestricted judgment, unquestioned judgment is a recipe for disaster. And he has cooked that stew for himself. All autocrats tend to do. And we know what happened with Saddam Hussein.
Our conversation on Ukraine with Dr. Mazzarella and Dr. Tatiana Rizova of CNU will continue here in just a moment. But right now, let us offer this, shall we say, gentle reminder. Make 2022 the year you start, continue, or finish your education. And at Thomas Nelson, we're, of course, always ready to help. We've been educating members of the military community for over 50 years. We've got more than 80 degree and certificate programs, many of them completely online, and we're affordable. If you're using military tuition assistance, for example, you automatically receive a tuition discount no matter where you're stationed in the military. And credits earned at TNCC will easily transfer to other colleges and universities. In fact, we have articulation agreements with more than 40 other institutions. Learn more about how we can help you achieve your educational goals. Visit tncc.edu/military. Or if you prefer, you can contact us by phone. You can reach the team that handles active duty, Guard and Reserve personnel, and military spouses. That number is 757-825-2938. And if you're using VA benefits, call that team at 757-825-4075. Success, it's closer than you think. At Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. Obviously, Putin may or may not care that much about what the average Russian in the street thinks about what he's doing right now, but he does have constituencies that are important to him, the oligarchs, for example, the security services, the military. Where do you see support for Putin among those key constituencies right now?
So I do think that he does have the support of the Siloviki, security services, and his high-ranking officials. And frankly, as long as he can keep paying them off, they will probably be on his side. So I think one of the potentially successful strategies Western countries have relied on in this case is to literally smoke the oligarchs out of the yachts, to use a well-familiar phrase. So I think as long as he can keep paying them off, they will be on his side. But they will very quickly turn away from him and become his enemies when he stops providing all the economic goods. And at that point, they will probably become unlikely allies of our cause, that of preventing that invasion from continuing and ensuring the sovereignty of Ukraine.
That has been the classic downfall of some kingdoms. When the kings could no longer obtain enough revenue to pay off their supporters, that support collapsed and the kingdom collapsed.
And on that note, given the economic sanctions being imposed by the U.S. and other Western countries right now, some very severe sanctions, how much longer can Putin continue to provide the economic goodies, incentives that the oligarchs and other influential groups are relying on right now? And at what point might they begin to turn on Putin?
I think based on what we've been hearing in the news over the past week or so, the group that has been most severely targeted, which also happens to be the wealthiest group, is that of the oligarchs. And I definitely think that this is the right path to ensuring that they're cut off from their resources and undermining their support for Putin. But one thing we do have to bear in mind is that this was a planned invasion. And Putin and his cronies have been stashing away resources for a very long time. So nobody really knows how many assets Putin, his family, his extended family have. So I think it technically could be sustained for as long as these resources last. So I think it could even go on for years, depending on the magnitude of these assets. The oligarchs will quickly turn away from him just because they're more exposed in the West. A lot of their assets are in Western banks. So as long as we can do a good job tracing these and shutting down these assets, the better off we are going to be from a strategic standpoint. So this could potentially go on for a really long time. Where I think that the pain and the cost of economic sanctions will be felt the most is in Russia itself. And, I have the deepest empathy and sympathy with the Ukrainian people, but I also feel for the Russian people, the pensioneri, the pensioners in Russia who are counting dime after dime and trying to survive in the midst of all the economic sanctions. These people are not for the war. Many of members of the Russian public have condemned it, have expressed their voice in protest, have been imprisoned, much like Russian dissidents who are rotting in jail right now. So I think the pain will be gravest among the Russian populace itself. And this is where things could really get out of control. And we could even see some, civilian issues, uprisings in Russia itself, because once that economic pressure is too unbearable and it's getting to that point, I do foresee the potential for problems in the streets of Russia as well.
By some accounts, as many as 3,000 Russian citizens have been arrested for protesting against the war since before it began. There have been sizable protests in St. Petersburg, Moscow, other cities. And that kind of leads me to this idea of trying to wage this kind of conflict in a social media age. Can Putin and his government, can they effectively suppress social media and manage opposition to the war in this age of Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook?
So I do want to point out I'm not an expert on social media and technology, but I am very confident that if the Russian government wanted to take full control of every social media in Russia and its vicinity, it would. One thing that is probably keeping them at bay for the time being is that they are relying on social media to get information about what goes on the ground as much as the Ukrainian government is. So, one thing that commentators have been wondering about is, why have we not seen more signs of a cyber warfare and attacks on social media accounts. And I think that's coming up. I don't think we're too far away from that phase of the conflict. One thing that we should not, and Putin has probably not underestimated, is the power of social media. And we do have to bear in mind that, yes, there is some censorship in Russia, but it is nowhere close to the extent that the Chinese government exercises that on its territory, for instance. So we could see in the upcoming days more control of social media. But I think right now, social media is certainly helping the Ukrainian effort quite a bit, and also the mobilization of the Russian people against the government, the Russian dissidents as well.
And I'm glad you raised that point, because going into the conflict, everyone assumed that because the Russians have made information operations a part of their strategy for a long, long time now, they're quite accomplished at disinformation, or disinformatia, as they call it. We thought the Russians would probably dominate in that area, but yet the Ukrainians have been very, very effective in using information operations to frame the war, to highlight their accomplishments, to point out Russian atrocities, other things like that. Have you been surprised at how successful the Ukrainians have been in the information operations space? And conversely, have you been surprised at how relatively poorly the Russians have performed so far?
I have not been surprised by the capacity of the Ukrainians to capitalize on their ability to use those types of resources. One thing that we shouldn't forget is that the education system in Ukraine is very good. And there is still a lot of emphasis on mathematics, IT, computer science. So while I'm not an expert in the field, I would dare say that Ukrainian experts are probably on par with their Russian counterparts. So I don't think they should be underestimated. I am not really surprised by the Russians' inability to deploy these resources. I think right now it's just a matter of a waiting game. I don't think that there's necessarily an erosion of their ability to rely on technology. I think it's really just a matter of time before we see its use.
If I might note something here, we're talking about public opinion. The Russians have a potential ally, us, in the United States and in Europe. You talk about how these sanctions will hurt the Russians and cause them pain and so forth. They're going to cause us pain too. There is no effort that does not require cost. I guess at the beginning of Lent, Christians celebrate now is a good time to talk about that. But if we are going to whine because, our gas prices are going up and I don't want to pay all that money, so never mind sanctioning Russia because I want to be able to drive cheaply, what are we willing to sell our soul for? Low gas prices? I'll pay myself personally what the hell I have to in order to spit in his eye like the soldiers on Snake Island did. We're calling you to surrender. What did you say? F you. That ought to become the Ukrainian national motto by this point. They should put it on their coins. It was magnificent. But are we willing to say that? How much sacrifice are we willing to make for the defense of liberty and freedom of other people? It's us too. Us not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for you. The attacks that are in Ukraine, we're next. Or at least our allies are. Well, it brings up something. Russia is a weak power. It has a declining population. It has a one-horse pony when it comes to the economy. It was dropping gas prices caused the fall of the Soviet Union because they could not sustain themselves. And if we can hit him hard there, we will really hit him hard. Most people don't know this, but in 1933, Germany was a weak power. Hitler wanted to make outbreaks, but he couldn't. He was blocked in everywhere because France, Britain, and Italy were actually united together in the front against him. But the Italians broke away because they wanted to attack Ethiopia. When they disrupted the Western wall that had been built against Hitler, then he was able to move. He needed to have trouble in order to move. So we attacked the Rhineland. That was the first step. Went on from there. So with Putin, if we stand united without breaking down, he has nowhere to go. If he tries to move against a NATO power, he's going to run into the power of the United States directly, and I don't think he wants to do that. If he has any sanity at all, he knows that this could get really out of hand really fast. I would expect Moldova would be next on his hit list. I see Moldova has thus for entry into the European Union too. And that's another thing. There has been this kind of disillusionment over the years, the last few years. Oh, do we really need the European Union? I thought the British did probably the second stupidest geopolitical move of the 21st century, which is Brexit. The first political move was the invasion of Ukraine. And, do we really need NATO? What's it for? It's like an old relationship where you no longer appreciate your partner. Then all of a sudden you get sick or something and she's standing right there with you, supporting you. And you think, gosh, now I remember why I love this person. Well, people are discovering why they need NATO and the EU. Yeah, we need to be united against a tyrant like this.
And we'll talk in a moment about NATO's reaction so far, but I want to touch on a point that, again, has gotten a lot of attention here in the last week or so, and this came very early in the conflict when Putin announced he was placing his nuclear forces on higher alert. And important to note, it was not the highest level of alert as some Western media outlets were reporting. Your thoughts on what that might mean? I mean, at this point, do you think this is more saber rattling than actual foreshadowing of a potential nuclear conflict?
If you were to ask me this question a week ago, I would have said absolutely, saber rattling. Asking me that question today, I am less convinced that it is just saber rattling. I sure hope he will not use nuclear weapons against anyone, and he will not even think about it. But as you said before, given comments about his mental state, physical state, you just never really know. Can we truly trust dictators?
So with that in mind, at what point or where would red lines be for Putin in terms of actually crossing the nuclear threshold? What would have to happen from his perspective for him to, again, initiate a nuclear conflict?
Tatiana, do you think he would do it if the Russian military suffered some real bad, bloody notes in Ukraine?
He could, yeah. That could be one of the red lines. Absolutely. He could get exasperated if he doesn't see the results he expects to see over the next few weeks, for instance. I think there's definitely an escalation of the potential, increase in the potential for that.
What if NATO decided to become more actively involved, let's say, transport aircraft flying military supplies into Western Ukraine, or the implementation of something that many people are talking about now, the implementation of a NATO-run no-fly zone over Ukraine? Could those be red lines for nuclear employment by the Russians? I mean, this is scary stuff here, folks.
I'm too scared to answer.
I was very young in 1962. Don't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We lived 25 miles from a SAC bomber base, so had the balloon gone up, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. And we had nuclear bombs on alert at the Memphis airport, not too far from our home. We're not at that point yet, thankfully. Hopefully we don't reach that point. But I think it's always worth noting that when Russia was a dominant nuclear power under the old Soviet Union, they never talked about the first use of nuclear weapons. They talked about nuclear weapons in response to an attack upon the Soviet Union. And with the dissolution of the USSR and the crumbling of their conventional forces, nuclear weapons, their great equalizer, became much more important in their strategic calculus. And so Russia now, in their military doctrine, their writings and publications, they actually have talked from time to time about first use of nuclear weapons in response to a serious conventional escalation by the adversary or Russian military setbacks, some of the things that you were talking about there just a moment ago.
I had always heard that every time we, in our war game playing, that we cross the line and use a nuclear weapon, thinking we'll just use one, they could never stop the war game from ending up in a full nuclear exchange between the two countries, just, blowing everything off. Apparently the Russians seem to have a different calculation. They can get away with one shot.
Yeah, I think the concept of limited nuclear war is a faulty assumption, and you can go very quickly and very easily from a localized tactical exchange into a full strategic exchange where ICBMs and SLBMs are flying back and forth in relatively short order, and then, of course, life on the planet as we know it pretty much comes to an end. Getting into NATO's reaction so far, there have been, talk about in recent years the NATO alliance deteriorating. There's been some squabbling among various NATO members. Have you been surprised at how quickly the alliance seems to have come together, fully united and determined to, basically stand off and face the challenge being put forward by the Russians?
Well, I think of Dr. Johnson's famous comment, when a man is to be hanged in a fortnight, depend upon it, sir. It concentrates the mind wonderfully. The disdain for NATO seems to have gone out the window because of the Russian threat. It's like, that's why we needed NATO. I mean, the Germans have been so reluctant to employ military force, ever since the reunification. I mean, remember World War II? I mean, we did all sorts of terrible things. Now they are sending military aid to Ukraine. The Swedes and the Finns are now talking about, maybe this neutrality isn't such a hot idea. Maybe we need to join NATO. And even the Swiss, as Stephen Colbert said, they didn't want to bother that much by Hitler, but this is too much. Even they're sending aid to Ukraine. This has shown once again why we need NATO, and has confirmed that situation. It also shows why Europe needs the European Union. In order to defend itself against the outbreaks of violence, as Nicolas Sarkozy said, without European unity, there were 2 world wars started in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. There's been nothing like that since. And unity like this could prevent another conflagration like that.
Well, for everything NATO has done so far, and they seem to be doing many, if not most, of the right things, could NATO, again, led by the U.S., have done more to determine or to demonstrate resolve and deter Russian aggression? I mean, let's be honest now. Putin's buildup for this operation began way back in November. We were tracking it via intelligence methods and everything, but yet reaction to it and in response to it really didn't come until the Russian tanks began rolling across the border into Ukrainian territory. So what might NATO have done earlier to potentially deter what's going on right now?
Well, I don't think it could have done much. In retrospect, we made a number of mistakes. We did not protest sufficiently and create sanctions sufficiently against earlier Russian moves. In Chechnya, in Crimea, in Donbass. And I think this emboldened Putin. Certain policies that even I felt were wise and prudent and careful. I mean, for instance, President Obama did not want to push the Russians too hard because he did not want to feed into Putin's narrative that the United States is against us, the West is against us. So he was too gentle with them. And so by the time Putin started on this, I think he was determined that, I can get away with this too. And now he sees that he's not going to be able to without a cost. So could we have done something sooner? I don't know. Maybe Dr. Rizova thinks somewhat differently, but I don't think so.
Could we have done more with the NATO led by the United States to show determination to prevent this invasion? I really don't think we could have done more because we have been very reluctant, and NATO has been very reluctant to poke the Russian bear. I think this particular situation has been a long time coming. I frankly think that the wars in Chechnya were just sort of a military exercise and a kind of a check for the Russian military, a preparation for grander invasions like this one, more impressive invasions like this one from the Russian standpoint. So while NATO has had its weaknesses and feeble moments, I really don't think it could have done more, given that some of the expectations were that if we were to witness some sort of military action it would probably not involve regions of Ukraine apart from the one where we already had the trouble, the Donbass and Luhansk. So I don't think that we could have done more given our knowledge of the situation as of November and December. Ukraine is not a NATO member, even though the vast majority of its people would probably like to join NATO and the European Union. So anything doing more than what we did would probably have been as just a provocation on behalf of NATO. And we could even have sped up the situation. The invasion may have even occurred earlier had we done more.
Looking ahead, let's kind of go to maybe a grim case scenario. Let's say the Russians are successful in eventually taking Kyiv, the other major cities, and they essentially control the eastern half of Ukraine, the area east of the Dnieper River. What do you see NATO's policy? What actions do you see coming from NATO if the Russians are successful in achieving most of their military objectives in Ukraine?
Well, one thing, if an active insurgency does take place, that the NATO powers might send supplies to it. Of course, it would enrage the Russians, enrage Putin, but I think we could do that.
And in that same vein, obviously, if there's going to be a funneling of military aid to Ukrainian insurgents, which there almost certainly would be, a lot of that material is going to come through some of the newer NATO states, potentially Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and that leaves them potentially very exposed to retribution from the Russians. I guess the question becomes then, how do we keep them on board? How do we keep them at the pointy end of the spear and minimize the potential exposure and risk they may be facing as being a primary conduit of military aid flowing to Ukrainian insurgents?
I don't see them as being anything but stronger in their determination to resist. That's why they joined NATO to begin with. You said they're the point of the spear. You're right. But if they cut themselves off, I mean, it's impossible to consider. If they cut themselves off, you can't have a point of a spear without a long shaft behind it. And that long shaft is the power of the United States, and the ability to do damage to any enemy that attack them. Now, I don't think that they would be reluctant to send help because they know that united, we stand in mutual protection. But divide us, and they could be picked off one at a time. And they know that.
I think your point about the need for that long end of the shaft to support the pointing of the spear is very, very appropriate. We had a situation that happened during the early days of the crisis. There was some talk from the EU that they were going to finance the transfer of Russian-made fighter jets from NATO countries like Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, MiG-29s that are still operated by those air forces, transfer them to the Ukrainians because the Ukrainian Air Force also operates the MiG-29. That would be a way to bolster Ukrainian air power at a time when they really need that kind of help. And there was a lot of talk, a lot of excitement. You had senior EU officials saying this was going to happen in a matter of hours. And then over the course of the next several days, the deal kind of fell apart. And there appeared to be some hesitation from the Poles, the Slovaks, the Bulgarians for obvious reasons, because we're asking them to give up a good chunk of their frontline combat capability. And I guess their question is, all right, who's going to backfill to make sure that we don't lose capability by giving our jets to the Ukrainians? And then what happens if the Russians come knocking?
Yes, I completely agree with that assessment. You can't deprive them of their first line of defense and expect not to provide additional support, because that will definitely leave them exposed. I do want to mention that, I've been watching the situation and the discussions in Bulgaria a little bit more closely since this is my home country. And while I don't really see hesitancy on behalf of the Bulgarian government, we definitely see some differences in how various political parties have approached the situation. Not surprisingly, of course, the communist successor party, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, has expressed the most hesitancy about showing any sort of support, military or financial, to to Ukraine. But I do not see any sort of fractures or differences inside the Bulgarian government itself. In fact, the Bulgarian prime minister just sacked the minister of defense because he had made a reference to the Russian invasion. He called it an operation rather than, which is the Russian term for what is going on in Ukraine right now. So if anything, I think he kind of demonstrated solidarity with the Ukrainians and the fact that Bulgaria is on the side of this besieged nation.
And the Poles have done a great deal as well. They're taking in upwards of 500,000 Ukrainian refugees so far, and many, many more will be flowing across that border in the days and weeks ahead. I want to touch on something that people have been looking for, and we haven't seen perhaps the level of activity that we thought we would, and that being cyber warfare. Have you been surprised at the relatively low level of cyber attacks from Russia and its surrogates so far in this conflict?
I think it's really just a matter of time before we see that. And Russia relies on information as much as any other country. So I think a cyber attack is not unlikely. We've already had so many incidents. And, frankly, one thing that I've noticed over the past few days is anytime I try to log into a website that has to do with a Ukrainian website or a Russian website, I usually get blocked. So I think we're definitely preparing for the potential of a cyber attack. And it is definitely a powerful weapon that the Russian government could easily deploy. So it could be a matter of just a strategic wait to see what happens before that tool is deployed. At the end of the day, the most immediately threatening thing is a physical military attack. But countries like ours can very quickly be paralyzed if our infrastructure is compromised in any way.
Would you be surprised if we don't see a Russian attempt or Russian surrogates attempt to make a crippling cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure, whether it's the power grid, water supply, banking and financial networks, things like that?
Honestly, I'll be surprised if we don't see that. I really hope that our cyber experts are very, are sleeping with at ease at night and getting ready for that.
And we talked about red lines earlier for potential Russian.
Have an equal capacity to retaliate, so we do not.
I think we have the capacity to retaliate, but that doesn't mean that the Russian government will not deploy that.
Well, we do have very impressive offensive. We do have very impressive offensive cyber capabilities. It's just that we, as a government, we as a nation, we're very judicious and very careful in the employment of that. And the reason for that is cyber tools, once they're unleashed, can very quickly make their way out of, for lack of a better term, government channels and then begin to affect, wider segments of the internet. And it could wind up again affecting, paralyzing segments that weren't even initially targeted. Whereas with the Russians and with the Chinese, with their various surrogates and everything, they're not bound by that criteria. They're much more willing to engage in these types of attacks. And conversely, again, they would probably be more likely to launch a major cyber attack on Western financial networks, power grids, and things like that. And that kind of leads me into my next question in this area. We talked earlier about red lines for potential Russian nuclear employment. What kind of red lines do you see out there that would prompt Putin, his advisors, to go ahead and launch that major cyber attack on Western computer networks?
I think that one of the red lines is probably going to be an incredibly crippling economic sanction. And the type of economic sanction I'm referring to is, completely blocking the Russian banking system. The system has already been compromised deeply, but anything that shuts it down is probably going to be considered a red line. And anything that certainly affects the Russian political elite directly is going to be seen as a red line. So I think we may already be there. It may be just a matter of days before we see that sort of retaliation to the stringent economic sanctions.
And that's a really good jumping off point into my last segment here with you. And again, I deeply appreciate you taking time to come on and discuss this very critical issue. Looking into your crystal ball, where do you see this conflict being in a week, in a month, in 3 months?
I'm a historian. We are experts at predicting the past, not so much the future. They say history repeats itself. It doesn't. The circumstances are always different. Sometimes it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We will have to see how it goes. A lot depends on whether, well, I think a conventional victory by the Russian military is definitely in order. Whether that will be followed by a truly active and damaging insurgency has yet to be proven. I would hope it would be, but we'll have to see. The proof will be in whether we see the action there. And the effectiveness of that will determine a lot. It will determine whether Putin is discredited for having gotten himself, to release a hornet's nest that is killing Russian soldiers left, right, and center. As picking at them like the worst kind of attacks that we suffered in Afghanistan and in Iraq. What if they're discredited at home? As somebody said, when the body bags start showing up back in Moscow, things are not going to look good. There's just so much you can hide. But again, I think everything depends upon how strong the resistance of the Ukrainians is. Personally, I hope that Zelensky, if it looks like he's going to fall, will get out of the city and continue to lead the fight from some other place to the very last, as long as he can go. So Hitler said that when you start a war, it's like walking into a dark room. You don't know what you're going to find. And indeed, Putin has walked into a dark room here, and I cannot see in the dark any better than you can or I can or anyone else.
You mentioned earlier that you think this could very well end with a conventional Russian military victory. What kind of a timeline, Dr. Mazzarella, do you think Putin has to achieve that victory? Because again, the Russians are going to be crippled by those economic sanctions we've been talking about. Public opposition for the war is growing. What kind of a timeline do you think he has realistically to achieve that kind of victory?
Well, I think his initial timeline was totally unrealistic. I think he thought it was going to be a walkover, just like the Russians thought there was going to be a walkover against the Finns. That has not happened. And as Dr. Rizova said, as he gets increasingly exasperated, he may turn to more desperate measures. You can always go back to World War II kind of warfare, saying, I want you to win at all costs, get moving. Okay, then we blow the hell out of everything, and move forward and, occupy the rubble. Now, that's possible. It's even possible in a desperate situation to say, well, look, we need to show these people that we'll do anything. Okay, let's hit them with the tactical nuke. That'll show them. Let's see if they want to face, how many times they want to face that. These things are all, all possible here. But I never expected the fall of the Berlin Wall. I never expected the fall of the Soviet Union. You think I want to make another prediction? I can't do that. We will have to see how things transpire.
Do you see any circumstances where NATO takes a more active military role in this conflict, to include the imposition of the no-fly zone over Ukraine that we were talking about earlier?
From what we've seen to date, there has been great reluctance to do that, even at a time when there's a great need for Zelensky and Putin to have a conversation and to negotiate with one another. Even then, there has been reluctance to provide that sort of guarantee. Who knows? I don't think that right now this is in the cards. But I certainly trust that the high command of NATO will resort to that action if the circumstances call for it.
Yeah, I personally can't see the circumstances ever calling for it, because once a Russian plane gets shot down by an American plane, or an American plane gets shot down by a Russian plane, that's opening a door, and it's going to be hard to close it. And I don't think anybody wants to go there. Anybody with any reason is afraid of that first step. Because anyone can take a first step. But then once you do that, everything else follows. And what follows could be World War III.
Yes, yes. Final question, or maybe I should say my next to last question. I could actually talk with you guys all day. This is truly fascinating and truly, truly insightful and informing. What are the most important things, maybe the three most important things that the U.S. and NATO should do to continue to manage this crisis moving forward? Do you think that we're kind of on the right track right now? Is there going to be a need to readjust and recalibrate our approach?
So one thing that we have seen has some success over the past week is that economic sanctions are definitely making an impact. Increasing our reliance on our own oil reserves is going to have an impact because that is going to reduce our dependence on Russian oil. All the actions, the unlikely actions that states in Europe have already engaged in, pledging support for the Ukrainians, I think all of that has made a difference. I think it is inevitable that we will have to continue providing military assistance because we are most likely going to look at a drawn out resistance in Ukraine in spite of probably a nearing conventional victory for the Russians. So military assistance, economic assistance will be a must. And of course, any sort of support behind the scenes of the cyber experts of Ukraine as well will definitely be of help. And certainly manifesting our commitment to democratic values. I think the speech President Zelensky gave to the European Union a few days ago was incredibly inspiring. And I think it demonstrated Ukrainians' desire to be part of, not the West. I really hate to use those geopolitical terms, not the West. They want to be part of a democratic world and a world that is increasingly interconnected and where everybody's taking full advantage of the benefits of economic globalization and political freedom. So the desire is there. We have to put our money where our mouth is. Let's just put it that way.
I couldn't agree more. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, says the scripture. Are we willing to expend the treasure necessary to defend freedom, to defend human dignity? If we're not, because we want to pay more for gas, what kind of a people are we? I hope we're better than that. And that will also be shown in the future.
Final question. We know that there is an emerging alliance, an alliance already in place for that matter, between Moscow and Beijing. How do you think the Chinese leadership, specifically Xi Jinping, how are they interpreting what's going on in Ukraine so far? How far are they willing to go in supporting Putin? And based on Putin's experiences so far in this conflict, what impact, if any, will that have on Chinese geopolitical decisions in their sphere of influence?
Well, the Chinese and the Russians have one thing in common. They both think the United States is the great enemy because, of course, we are the leader, whether we like it or not, of the free world, still are, in spite of last 4 years of our last president. And so they know that if they're going to make any move, it has to be, against us. They have to weaken us in some fashion. But that's their one area of unity. But the Chinese are all extremely uncomfortable with the idea of violating national borders. They had enough of that in their own history to make them dig in. That's why they have not approved what Putin has done in Ukraine. They haven't come out exactly and criticized it, but they don't like it. Furthermore, they're looking as to how the free world, the democracies, if you will, NATO and EU, react to this as a template for, and this is beginning to be talked about now, how they might act toward Taiwan. If it looks like the West and the United States and its friends cave in, then they'd probably cave in if the Chinese made a grab for Taiwan. If they stand strong against the Russians, it may make that bite look less appetizing.
I don't think that the Chinese government would be interested in any sort of military entanglement in the conflict. And so far, everything we've read about the stance of the Chinese government is sort of a very lukewarm response and neutrality on the issue. The one thing that we should definitely be concerned about, however, is the Russia-Chinese economic connection. And unfortunately, I think this is what is going to help the Russian economy tumble less slowly, less rapidly. Or it'll take more time for the Russian economy to be compromised because of the China-Russia economic relations. So, Western companies can ban the supply of technology and the sale of their products, but China is always going to be there. And the only thing that is going to be a bit of a predicament for Russia is just geography. They're neighbors, but it is let's just say a very big continent. So while transportation costs may increase, and that will cause a little bit of inconvenience for the Russian government, as long as China keeps trading with Russia, I think that will certainly keep the Russian economy a little bit stronger than we want it to be in this case. So we have to watch out for that connection.
I think that's a very, very good point. And I must say this has been truly a fascinating and very insightful conversation. I deeply appreciate both of you taking time out of your schedule. I think this has been spring break week at CNU, so taking some time from your time off to come in and discuss the situation in Ukraine. We've been talking with Dr. Tatiana Rizova, Associate Professor of Political Science at CNU, and her colleague, the Professor Emeritus of History at CNU, Dr. Mario Mazzarella. Again, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Gary. And I would just like to end our conversation with the Russian hashtag Нет войне, no to war.
Indeed. Indeed. This has been At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. Thanks for listening.